Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick unboxing of the Sony Cyber-shot DSC-RX100 II. Now this camera retails for $749.99. That's a full $100 more than the original RX100, which has seen some softening in pricing because after all it is almost a year old. However, the RX100 is still arguably the best pocket point-and-shoot camera ever made, so Sony really had their hands full when it came to actually complementing the product rather than rendering it obsolete. Or I should say, they really had their hands full in trying to render it obsolete, because this camera really does build its entire experience around what's found in the original RX100. You've got the same 1.8 Carl Zeiss lens, wide open, which is a great performer. You also have the same 1-inch Exmor-R CMOS sensor rated at the same 20.2 megapixels, but a clear, important difference is that the sensor here has been remanufactured, or at least redesigned in terms of how it's manufactured. It's no longer front illuminated, but rather rear illuminated, which ends up yielding, at least under Sony's marketing, a 40% improvement in low light sensitivity performance. So that's really critical, huge if true, although I have read that it also has led to some softer images when compared to the RX100. But of course, I'll be testing that and reporting back to you guys. Same metal, solid construction that you expected or at least enjoyed with the RX100, so really nothing changing. Form factor a little bit larger, but that's because it also has quite a few new features. We've got near-field communication, Wi-Fi. By the way, near-field communication is what is also known as NFC. You've also, as I just mentioned, have Wi-Fi for control and image transfer, and then you also now have a multi-interface hot shoe. And all of these things can take a toll on battery life because they all are dependent on that onboard Type X battery. Now, Sony rates that battery at 350 shots, which is still very respectable. I also want to point out this camera does also have a tilting or articulating LCD screen, another element missing from the original RX100. So there are some key differences with this camera, no question about it, but there's also a very strong argument for still picking up the RX100, which is why Sony did not look to replace the RX100, but rather complement it. I think that's also born out of the idea that there still is absolutely no competitor in the marketplace for the RX100, so why would Sony compete with itself? Instead, it created a camera for a different niche that was looking for these features, because most of these features speak to, I think, user feedback and Sony acknowledging that and adding it to a camera where they knew they could feasibly do it. So in terms of what's included, we've got an AC adapter, we also have the rechargeable battery pack, that Type X battery I mentioned before, a micro USB cable for charging and transfer capability, a wrist strap, and a strap adapter. And then as far as branding, play memories, because that's Sony's proprietary software that you'll be using or not using with the camera, HDMI, because there is a micro HDMI output on the camera, Dolby certification for the stereo onboard audio, a multi-interface. That's because Sony's micro USB charging system also doubles as a host now for accessories like Sony's brand new wired remote control for shutter release. So that's another cool accessory. I think it's about $50. Right there you see the logo for Sony's multi-interface hot shoe, which of course a very big addition to this camera. A lot of people are going to be happy now that they can use an electronic viewfinder, even though it is very costly at $450. SDXC support and memory stick support. With that said, let's get it out of the box so I can actually show you guys what you've been waiting to see. But I did want to give the background because a lot of people do perceive this as a replacement to the RX100, but as I mentioned before, Sony's been very clear about this being a complementary model, just an alternate option, and really not a replacement. So the obligatory warranty paperwork, a Wi-Fi connectivity guide, again, NFC, I can't stress enough how important that is, and I'll get into that in my reviews because really, this is the first Sony camera to have NFC, and while many people may think at face value that's a gimmick, I can assure you near-field communication is as far from a gimmick as possible. It's really going to take all of the hassle or clunkiness out of mating the camera with whatever near-field communication-enabled smartphone or tablet you want to use it with, which I'll demonstrate in videos down the road. But let's first get the camera out of here so you guys can see it. And right out of the packaging, you can see it is virtually identical to the older RX100. The design is exactly the same. The only real difference, it's a little bit thicker, which also renders it a little bit heavier, and that's because of the articulating screen, which I'm going to pull out right here. As you can see, it doesn't have a tremendous amount of motion, but you can always use the EVF, which is certainly a nice feature. It doesn't come up. For those of you who are curious, you can see that's the range of motion right there that I just demonstrated. That's it. But that's still a major improvement over the original, which had absolutely no flexibility and really only rendered the camera a slimmer profile. So I think a lot of people, in fact most, would welcome this sort of couple of millimeters in thickness, if it's even that now facilitates a flexible viewfinder option without having to break out the $450 electronic viewfinder. Of course, you can see some Wi-Fi marketing there, because this does, like many other Cyber-shot cameras like the HX50V, it does now have Wi-Fi control capability. You can use a smartphone or tablet as your viewfinder and actually remotely control the camera. You can take stills, video, control the zoom, just about anything. It does not support the Play Memory Store like the NEX models, for those of you that are curious. I would have liked to have seen that, because it would have been great to have something like any of those apps, quite frankly, that are out there, but specifically time-lapse is what I think this camera really could use. The screen is identical, even though, as I mentioned before, it is now an articulating screen, which is certainly more flexible and arguably a lot more interesting and easy to use, frankly. It is identical in terms of quality, as far as I know. The layout of buttons, also identical. Really, Sony not trying to reinvent this camera, because this camera, at least with regard to identity, has, as I mentioned before, blown everything else away. So why do away with anything? They're only looking to improve it. On the right side of the camera, they have changed things a little bit. We now have, beyond a micro HDMI port, they have a multi-port. As I mentioned before, that is really just a micro USB charging port. You can also transfer your images if you don't want to use NFC or Wi-Fi. But more importantly, it's because Sony now has enabled that USB port to do other things with other accessories. This is another thing the RX100 cannot do. So that might be critical to you. It may not be. Either way, I wanted to point it out. So that's the only other thing that's really new there. On the bottom of the camera, we have our battery bay, as well as SD card slot and memory stick slot. It is a single slot, like all of Sony's Cyber-shot cameras that support both formats, and single battery, of course. Your tripod mount right there. NFC logo is right there, so that's where the connection is going to be made when you're actually doing a tap for NFC to do any kind of controller transfer. Let's take a look at the top of the camera. As you can see, we've got the exact same dial mode found on the original RX100, same power button, same zoom toggle. I mean, everything is identical, but then you've got the multi-interface hot shoe, and with that, it opens up a whole world of possibilities. You've got electronic viewfinders, well, not finders plural, but you have an EVF, you have an optical viewfinder. I mean, these are all really expensive. The EVF is $450. You can pick up an external microphone, which I've already reviewed, for roughly $140. You can also pick up, I'm trying to think of what other accessories, an external flash that I've also reviewed. So really, this does take the regular RX100, which I think now is squarely aimed at someone really just looking to get the best performance out of a pocket camera, and turns this market, or rather, this market is identified with someone who wants to go beyond that. They want further control. They want to have the ability to use that hot shoe. They really want to try to use this camera above and beyond the auto mode. That's my best way of putting it. And that's not to say that the user who would pick up the RX100 wouldn't use the camera in auto mode. Don't misunderstand me, because really, both cameras have great manual control. It's just a matter of this is actually allowing for more manual control in the sense of physical limitations that were present in the RX100 not being or not existing here. So between the EVF possibilities, all of those things, I think the hot shoe represents another level of photography than the regular RX100. In fact, that was one of the biggest complaints, was that there was no way to get an EVF or anything really attached to the camera. So hot shoe, I think, was something we all expected and hoped for. Of course, the same flash right here pops out, and a little bit of branding. On the front side of the camera, again, everything looks exactly the same. The Zeiss branding is still there, Sony branding. This camera is made in China, which is nothing to worry about. For those of you wondering why things have changed, it's just a matter of sourcing. Originally, the RX100 was made in Japan, and then that shifted midway through its cycle. And that's why these cameras are now made in China as well. It's just a matter of where Sony has decided to make their product. So it's not an indication of a quality drop or anything like that. It still feels the same. I expect it to operate the same, just the way RX100s made in China operated the same way that ones made in Japan did. So don't worry about quality control. Don't apply a stigma where there shouldn't be one. The actual zoom control has improved. They now have a step control on the zoom, so you can actually control exactly how precise you want it to be. These are all things I'll cover through the course of the time I spend with this camera, but really just excited to see it in my hands finally, because it does represent an improvement upon what already, as I keep saying, is the best point-and-shoot camera that is pocketable, at least, that has ever been made. So let me put the camera down. I also want to point out the camera supports 24p now. In the past, only 60p with the RX100, so that's another improvement you're getting, a step up in your different video-supported resolutions. Now, the power brick is the same one that we get with pretty much every Cyber-shot camera, so nothing new or unique there, as is the micro USB cable. Also, the exact same micro USB cable you'll find with pretty much every Cyber-shot camera. So again, Sony, nothing to reinvent here. They've standardized all of their accessories. Now, some of you will say, how come I'm not getting an actual, real bona fide wall charger? Well, that's because Sony has decided the convenience of having a charger, or rather a product that's supported by one charger, because really, micro USB, after all, is the standard for smartphones, many tablets, so why not have one cable that can charge everything? And at least with regard to Sony's smartphones and now all of their Cyber-shot cameras, that is true. One cable does rule them all. You also have this included hand strap, which is standard fare, and then finally, I believe the battery is buried down there. Yep, there it is, as well as the strap adapter that I mentioned before. So this is that Type X battery, standard fare for all Cyber-shot cameras now, rated at 350 shots. Again, I want to focus on that. That's 350 just shots. That's not if you're using, the EVF or an external mic or any of the other accessories, or if you're using Wi-Fi a lot or NFC. That's strictly a rating for actual shot-to-shot use with no other perks at play. So let me get the box out of the way. And, the camera really, as far as I can tell, I like what I see, because as I've said throughout the course of this video, construction, build, all same as what is found with the RX100, which is exactly what I wanted to see. And really, much like the HX50V, it seems as if Sony is actually listening to their customers, because that's what this model, in my opinion, really reflects. An RX100 that already set the market for what to expect out of best-in-class performance, improved upon by basically very small things. Nothing drastic was done. After all, we're looking at the same sensor. Yes, as I mentioned, it's now rear illuminated rather than front illuminated, and even though that may yield a 40% improvement, the reality is that the lens and sensor are the same at the end of the day. The build and look and feel is exactly the same. The only things that are really notable, if the sensor really does end up being a negligible difference in quality, let's say the low light is a wash, is really that articulating screen, the hot shoe, the NFC, and the Wi-Fi. And I think the breakthrough feature here really is the NFC, because the NFC is not found in any Sony camera to date. This is the first one with near-field communication. And as I mentioned, when it comes to Wi-Fi, it's great to have it on any camera, no question about it. But I think a lot of people end up not using it just because it's clunky, sometimes takes a while to connect with their respective device, and that ends up putting them off to the experience. Well, that's where NFC is going to bridge the gap. That touch, that physical contact, the tap that it's going to make with the respective device you plan to use it with is going to mate it. And that mating being instantaneous is going to change the way people perceive using cameras, especially pocketable ones like this, with other wireless devices, or I should just say smart devices like their smartphones and tablets. And I think that may be the big difference in making people more aware of a feature like NFC being so important to the success of a camera. Wi-Fi is great, but it has its limitations, and I think that's where the Mark II is going to prove that it really needs both. If you have a camera that just has Wi-Fi, well, then you're really missing out, at least based on what I've seen so far, because that clunkiness of that Wi-Fi experience is void once you have NFC on board. Of course, you will have to have devices that have an NFC chip on them, but most of us do at this point, either with a smartphone or tablet, even though a lot of tablet manufacturers now are excluding NFC from their devices. Not Sony. Of course, part of Sony's marketing with the Xperia Tablet Z that I already covered, it does have NFC, so that's another great device to use this with. Any of Sony's smartphones, the Xperia Z smartphone, again, another great example. But any smartphone like my Note 2 I'll be doing a demo with, I expect good things because that is part of the promise of what you're getting now with this next generation. So there's no question the RX100 Mark II is not a replacement. I hope I've made that extraordinarily clear. It's simply a camera for those of you out there looking for the things that you felt were missing from the original. And again, Sony has no reason to replace something that no competitor has been able to challenge. If you guys have any further questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.